Hey, what's up? This is Steven with Rabbit Hobbies. In this step-by-step video, I'm going to show you how I painted Lucy from Fallout Wasteland Warfare by Modiphius. I'm going to show you how to take your miniature from looking like this to looking like this. Now, I scoured through the footage from the Fallout TV show, and I actually couldn't find anywhere in the show that matched up with the miniature completely, but I think I know what the inspiration was. Take a look at this clip.
Are you mad?
Young lady, come back here right away!
Lucy! Lucy, no!
That didn't work.
Now this moment right here is where I think this miniature is from. We have the steps, we have the skulls, we have the cracked dry earth. Now she doesn't yet have her shoulder pauldron or her harness, but this definitely matches her base. So let me show you how I painted her.
Okie dokie.
So one of the things I do with some resin miniatures when painting them is to give something to hold on to. I use a pair of forceps and I clip them onto the miniature itself. This gives me a nice, easy painting handle to use, and they lock into place. And to prepare her for painting, I gave her a priming of black, and then I sprayed a zenithal prime of white from above, preserving the darkest shadows underneath. This just gives me the best results when using speed paints. A lot of people call this technique slap chop. As you can see, I did the same thing to the base. So for the base coat for Lucy's Vault 33 jumpsuit, I'm going to be using High Lord Blue by the Army Painter Speedpaint. I feel like this is the closest to the color from the show. Also, this is factoring in that I will be using an oil wash later, so some of these colors are going to be darkening down. Now overall, I was pretty sloppy with this coat because I knew that I'm going to be going over and painting many of these sections. It's easy to correct any mistakes with white paint if you need to. Essentially, I'm painting with speed paint over most of the areas, and then I'm going in with highlights using Army Painter Fanatic paints. Kind of a hybrid of the slap chop method along with regular layering and highlighting. Now, most people painting Lucy's backpack tend to do like a brown leather, but I want it to be more true to the show, so we're going to start with a blue base coat here as well. We're going to paint the pockets this beige color with the blue lettering, and also the bright yellow bedroll. But for now, we're just boxing in this base coat. Now to base coat all of our leather boots and straps and such, I'll be using Satchel Brown by Army Painter Speedpaint. Just putting a couple drops on my fidget palette, and lightly load my brush to make sure I don't get any paint in the ferrule. For the larger areas, you can just kind of slap this on. Just be careful not to cover up your blue base coat. Now I'm going to come in much more carefully and paint the straps on all of her leather. And blocking in her belts. Now, speed paint tends to have a low surface tension. It likes to run into recesses, so keep that in mind when you're painting details like these tiny straps. If you overload your brush, you're going to quickly have a mess on your hand. Now, feel free to use an opaque paint for this step instead of a speed paint. I just like the level of pre-shading that I get. Continue painting like this until all the leather is painted, then we're going to work on the base while it dries. Next step is the base. Now for my base coat here, I used Ancient Honey and Pallid Bone mixed in a 1:2 ratio. Now for this, you just kind of slap it on. Any place where you see excessive pooling, you can use your brush to just pull it away. But these speed paints work better if you go a little thick. Now we just gotta give it some time to dry. And we're gonna base coat her hair with some Army Painter Speedpaint Grim Black. Now Ella Purnell actually has very dark brown hair, and this Grim Black will serve as a good undercoat for that. Now it's time to break out the wet palette because it's time to add some more detail to our base. For this I'll be using Army Painter Fanatic paints. Now for the debris I'll be using a mix of Paratrooper Tan and Ash Gray. On my wet palette I'm blending the two colors together so I have a nice gradient to choose from as I'm painting the details. I carefully go in and I paint each bit of rock and rubble on the base, just looking to add some color variability, and it may look like it sticks out a bit too much at first, but we're going to be dulling everything back down later with an oil wash and also dry brushing. I'm just kind of picking out random tones within my blend on the wet palette for this. Painting the steps real quick with some watered down ash gray. Now for the skeleton on the base, I'll be using Army Painter Fanatic's Tomb King Tan, Skeleton Bone, Bony Spikes, and for the brightest highlights, Pale Sand.
Oh shit, not good.
First step is to base coat all of the bone details with Tomb King Tan. These Army Painter Fanatic paints have terrific coverage, so usually one coat, or at tops 2 coats is enough to cover the details. Take your time and pick out all of the bony bits. Gradually, we're painting from darkest to lightest across our palette, and covering less area each pass. It's also important to pay attention to where the light would naturally be hitting. Roll your brush on the wet palette to preserve your tip. Pure pale sand will be used for only the very smallest area where the top points of light is hitting the model. Now for the rusty metal pipes on the base, I'll be using Dryad Brown by Warpaints Fanatic. We're taking our time just covering all the bits of rusty metal with the Dryad Brown paint. Now for the concrete one of the pipes is sticking out of, I will be using Uniform Gray by Army Painter Fanatic. This is a great neutral gray color, and we're going to be shading it just with the oil wash later. And back to the Dryad Brown for the other pipe. And with that, the base coating of the base is complete. Alright, time to dry brush. I have my homemade dry palette, and I have a dry piece of paper towel, and I use some of the residual moisture from my wet palette to dampen my brush slightly. I'm using some of the pale sand that was already on my palette for this, rubbing my brush on the paper towel till very little paint comes off, and then I'm testing the effect on my dry palette to make sure it looks the way I want it to look on the miniature. The effect is really subtle at first because I want to avoid any streaking, but as you can see it gives a nice dusty look to the base overall. It also kind of ties all the colors together. Now it's time to do away with the forceps and glue Lucy down to the base. My favorite superglue to use is the Medium by Starbond, which comes with these really nice precision applicators. Now we just carefully set Lucy in place. And just give it a few seconds for the glue to dry. Alright, all glued down and ready to keep going. Now it's time to base coat the metals. For her gun and Pip-Boy, I'll be using Vallejo Metal Color Steel. This is a very fluid paint. It's perfect to run straight out of an airbrush. You do have to be careful when brushing it on that you don't get too much flowing on into the ferrule and messing up your bristles, or just running around the model itself, but I do find the sheen is amazing. The Vallejo Metal Color line is truly impressive. Very realistic sheen, and the coverage is just fantastic. Make sure we hit our buckles in addition to the gun and the Pip-Boy. And we'll be using Vallejo Silver for the highlights. This is a gorgeous bright silver paint. We'll be focusing on the upper edges, the raised details, anywhere the light would be catching. This silver instantly gives us sharp silver highlights to all the edges of our miniature. And of course, don't forget the buckles. Next, for the skin tones, we'll be using Moonstone Skin, Agate Skin, Opal Skin, and Pearl Skin, all by Warpaints Fanatic. Mixing up our base coat of Moonstone Skin with a bit of water on our brush, and apply it all over all the fleshy areas. This is going to be the warm undercoat of all the skin tones. Make sure your paint is nice and thin, kind of a skim milk consistency, and it's okay to do a couple layers if you need to for coverage. You don't want it to look chalky or lumpy. I like to test out the consistency of my paints on the back of my thumb as I'm painting to make sure it's flowing off the brush like I expect. Alright, base coat is looking good. Now we're adding in some of our highlight colors and blending them together. And now we're painting in the highlights. We're focusing on the raised areas of the skin, like the eyebrow, the top of the nose, the cheekbones, the chin, top of the fingers, anywhere that the light would hit. We're leaving the Moonstone Skin in the recesses and as our shadow color. Keep in mind that when your paint is still wet, it's going to look a lot more opaque and it's going to look a lot lighter than it will on the dried model. Now we're adding in some Opal Skin for the next highlight color. And we're covering an even smaller area this time, just the very uppermost raised areas. Again, just a touch on the top of the nose, touch on the cheekbones. And we're leaving the previous two layers underneath. We're even touching the uppermost edges of the eyelids and the tips of the ears. Gradually, we're lightening up our mix. And we're creating our final highlights on the uppermost raised edges of all of the skin. And now we're starting to add in our brightest highlight color for the skin. Very sparingly, but keep in mind it will darken down a little bit as it dries. I find if anything, I tend to under-highlight. Here's how the skin should look after all of our highlight layers. It looks a little flat because we still have to finish painting her lips and eyes. For her lips, we'll be using Moonstone Skin from Army Painter Fanatic. And this will bring back some of the warmth that we lost with all of our layers of highlights. This can be very watered down, just a glaze consistency. For painting her eyes, we'll be using Matte Black by Warpaints Fanatic and Pale Sand. A lot of water mixed into this. We want it to be a very flowy paint. We don't want to overload our brush though. As you can see, we just need to kiss the surface. I use some eye magnification when I do this kind of painting. Now for the sclera of the eyes, I use Army Painter Pale Sand. And for details like this, I'm checking the consistency on the back of my thumb. Now this brushstroke is basically a horizontal line from left to right. I want to preserve the black and line in between. Here's how the eyes should look at this stage. Next, we need to paint the irises. For this, we'll be using Brigadine Brown by Warpaints Fanatic. And for this last step, I'm going all the way to my 000, my smallest brush from Artis Opus. When painting extremely tiny details like eyes, one of the problems I've run into is the tip of my brush drying. Now, a good trick here is to use Flow Improver, Slow Drying Medium, or Drying Retarder. Any of these kinds of mediums can help you have more uptime with your tip. And again, testing on your hand to make sure that you have the amount of fluid you want and that the tip is what you'd like is very important for precision.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Alright, so at this point my camera overheated and I ended up losing the footage of painting the irises. If you want to see this, I recommend checking out other tutorials you can find online. I'll be linking some in the description of the video. On a model this small, it's generally just a very small vertical line near the center, and you have to be very careful during this step to make sure your miniature doesn't end up looking cross-eyed. Alright, back to the rest of the video. Now for painting the yellow parts of Lucy's jumpsuit, we'll be using Ancient Stone, Space Dust, and Demonic Yellow, all from the Warpaints Fanatic range. First, we're using the Ancient Stone to paint the pockets on Lucy's backpack. Now, most of the Warpaints Fanatic range has tremendously good coverage. This paint is not one of them I have found. It may take you a couple coats to get complete coverage. Just take your time and pick out all the edges and details. I'll be relying on the oil wash to do most of the heavy lifting on shading on this one. Her bedroll is quite a bright yellow color, so I'll be using Space Dust for this. Again, I'm mostly relying on the oil wash to do my shading and highlighting on this piece. Now the base coat for the yellow on her jumpsuit, I'll be using Demonic Yellow, which covers fantastically for a yellow. I absolutely love this paint. Take your time hitting all the yellow trim on her jumpsuit and lettering. I'm also going to come in with pale sand and just pick out her undershirt. Now mixing in some Space Dust into the Demonic Yellow for our highlight on all the trim and lettering. And just layering on the upper raised surfaces of her lettering and on the trim on her jumpsuit. Now for painting Lucy's hair, we'll be using Matte Black and Brigadine Brown. For the lightest highlights, we'll be using Leather Brown. Now for this first coat, we're going to be using almost all black with a tiny bit of Brigadine Brown in there. And what we're going to be doing is cleaning up any edges where the flesh is meeting the hair, any highlights where the speed paint didn't quite do its job, and just cleaning up the hair in general. Carefully paint in her eyebrows. Be particularly careful around the ears. In the past, this is a spot I've tended to miss. Now we're working with more pure Brigadine Brown with a little tiny bit of black mixed in. And we're going to be lining the hair following the direction the texture's moving. Keep in mind the goal here is a very dark black brown. Mixing in a little bit of leather brown into our color. We want to be very sparing with this because we don't want to make her hair light brown. We just want to give some highlights. Be very careful with this and pay close attention to where the light would naturally be glistening off the hair. Alright, moving on to the leather, we'll be using Brigadine Brown, Bootstrap Brown, Leather Brown, Paratrooper Tan, and Command Khaki. Now we're going over all the leather bits with a mix of Brigadine Brown and Bootstrap Brown. We don't have to be too careful here, as I'll explain later, rough is good. Make sure we leave quite a bit of the undercoat underneath. Focusing the attention on building up the layers on the raised surfaces and where the light would hit, and any sharp creases in the leather. This can be the edges of the pauldrons or elbow pads, or it can be creases in the boots where the boot is bent. Now we're working with pure leather brown, which is our mid-tone. And going back over in a similar process, we're going to be leaving the previous layers showing and hitting less and less of the surface, focusing on the uppermost areas and the raised details, any creases and cracks. This is where we're building up the texture, which is going to make the leather look more believable on the finished model. Be careful at this point not to get paint on the blue undercoat, but don't worry too much about your precision on your strokes on top of these details. It's going to make it look more like leather in the end. Now we're mixing in our paratrooper tan into our leather brown for some of our highlights and some scratches. Here you're working on picking out some of the raised areas and the edges of the model, but also applying little tiny scratch marks around it to imply worn out leather. Because over time leather wears unevenly, edges where more abrasion happens tend to get lighter, creases, things like that. And this is where trying to be more precise with your highlighting actually is a detriment. You want to be kind of random and scratchy with your highlighting here. Sometimes rough is good. We're not always edge highlighting Space Marine armor. So consider the texture of what you're painting when you're thinking about your brush strokes. It's okay to freehand and brush in your own scrapes and scratches and wearing on top of that leather. It'll make it look more convincing in the end. Alright, let's paint a Pip-Boy screen using Angel Green, Eternal Hunt, and Leafy Green by Warpaints Fanatic. To start out, we base coat the screen in Angel Green. In this step, we're just looking for all-over coverage. Then we add a quick highlight of Eternal Hunt. Now the goal here is to scratch in some detail to suggest the Pip-Boy screen and what the contents would be on it. You can see the horizontal lines of text, and any graphic would be centered in the middle. And that's what I'm suggesting here. This miniature is far too small to try to make any real strong details here. Just the outline and essence of what might be on the screen. Last step before the oil wash, we're going to paint our base rim black. And I'll be using matte black for this. Now to rim the raised part of the base, I used Barren Dune. This is slightly watered down. The coverage on this paint is fantastic. For the lettering and logo on the backpack, I used Royal Blue. For painting such small lettering like this, it's important to have your paint slightly watered down, but be careful not to overload your brush, else it'll run into the recesses and ruin all that detail. Again, I test the way it's going to look on the back of my thumb. Now to protect all of our hard work before the oil wash, we're going to gloss varnish the whole model. This can be applied with either a brush or an airbrush. Right now it's time for the oil wash. I use Winsor & Newton Artist Oil Colors Ivory Black and Burnt Umber. I use a pea-sized dollop of each. Thin down in about a 4:1 ratio of mineral spirits to paint. I mix it up and check the consistency on the side of the container. Do not be afraid to get into oil washing. It is amazing. It's so much more forgiving than acrylic washes, and it does so much heavy lifting on some of these models. It can actually be used to speed paint, which is something that I'm going to show in a later video. To start, I'm using this black wash, and I'm going to be using it on all the metallic bits, also on her hair and her jumpsuit. You can be pretty liberal with the application of this because we're going to be taking a lot of it off in the end. Oil washing is kind of a subtractive process, as you will see later as we rub off the upper layers and re-expose our highlights. One of the reasons oils work so well is you have so much uptime where you can make adjustments to it, whereas acrylic washes are so much prone to pooling and tide marking, coffee staining. They can be kind of a pain to work with. Now, without even cleaning off my brush, I'm mixing up the burnt umber with a little bit of that black paint. This is what I use for shading on the base and a slight amount on some of the skin. It's okay to be kind of heavy here because you can use your brush to kind of wick away any excess later. This is a very forgiving technique. Making sure I get her bedroll on her backpack. After you've made all of your final adjustments, then all you have to do is wait for this to dry. I give it about an hour to an hour and a half. And this is how she looks. Not bad, but still can be much improved. She's a little shiny. Also, we're going to use mineral spirits and some sponges to bring back our highlights while preserving some of the shading we just did. I love using these little makeup sponges for this. In this first step, I'll use the sponge totally dry, no mineral spirits on here, and you'd be surprised at how much wipes away. However, the deepest shading is still preserved. Now she's not looking too bad, but we can do better with some mineral spirits. For this, I just put a drop or two on the makeup sponge. This is going to take off the vast majority of the oil wash on the upper raised surfaces and bring back those highlights. Now she's looking pretty good, but man, she is still so shiny. Luckily, we can fix that. Be using some matte varnish to bring this shine down. For this step, you can use a brush, but I'm going to be using an airbrush. It's just much faster and easier. My preferred matte varnish is matte varnish from Liquitex. Now for matte varnishes in particular, you really have to shake the crap out of them. I've found that if you don't shake them enough, you end up with just kind of a satin or even like a gloss varnish. You'll notice through the airbrush, the matte comes almost immediately. It's almost like magic. It happens right before your eyes. And there she is, nice and matte finish. Now I felt like being a little extra here, so I took some rust from Dirty Down, which is just a beautiful water-soluble effects paint. I've used their verdigris and their moss before, and their rust is just as awesome. I'm painting this on those pipes that I had painted earlier with Dryad Brown, just to give them a bit of a pop. You do want to use Dirty Down after your varnish. There's something about the varnishing process that really dulls down the effect of Dirty Down paints. So this is always one of my absolute last steps on a model. Now I just realized that I forgot to paint her silver badge on her jumpsuit. So for this I'll be using Polished Silver by Army Painter Speedpaint. I decided to use the speed paint because I already did my oil wash, and this gives a very slight, subtle shading to it. I've actually been quite impressed by the quality of the Army Painter Speed Paint 2.0 metallics. They cover really well and have a nice metallic sheen. And with this last step, Lucy is done. Alright, and with that, she's all done. Let's take a look at the grand reveal. Thank you so much for watching if you made it to this point. Give me a comment, like, and subscribe. What should I paint next?